Welcome to the Chinese Medicine Podcast with your host, Marie Hopkinson, Chinese medicine practitioner. Hi, I'm Marie Hopkinson. Welcome back to the Chinese Medicine Podcast. And today we're going to be talking about some classical roots of Chinese medicine, particularly in acupuncture and the channels, and some really good points about where Chinese medicine is going and where it could be going, and some really great ideas that Michael's got. So this is Michael Brown. He's a Chinese medicine practitioner, and we're in very hot and humid Queensland at the moment. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Marie, for having me.
Awesome. And Michael's the author of this book. He's the translator of this book.
Yeah, and I worked with my editor, Alan Saw. It's available through Amazon and published by Purple Cloud Press.
Awesome. Okay. And so we're going to be talking about his new book today, and we're also going to be talking about some things, interviewing Michael about some things that he's passionate about Chinese medicine. And so if you're a student of Chinese medicine, this would be really up your alley. If you're a patient of Chinese medicine, you're one of our regular subscribers, or someone that's just really interested in knowing a bit more information about acupuncture and herbs, and particularly the practitioners in the West that are doing what they're doing, this is going to be really interesting for you. So hope that you enjoy today's episode. So Michael, let's just talk about your background in Chinese medicine. So you've studied at Endeavour College, you did a Bachelor of Acupuncture there, and then you went on and did some further studies in translation of the Chinese language, right?
So I finished my acupuncture degree in about 2009.
Yep.
And during one of my last clinics there, a teacher of mine called Greg Bantic, I asked him this question, and I said, well, how do you know what is true in Chinese medicine? And I think that's kind of a question that many students, probably practitioners, everyone has asked at some point. Well, how do I know what is true and what isn't?
Yeah. And
so he said to me, well, go learn Chinese.
Right.
And then you'll be able to find out for yourself.
Yeah, okay.
And
I bet that wasn't the answer you were looking for.
Well, no, but it set me on the path where I decided when I finished my studies that I would go and enroll in Chinese language. Awesome. I was lucky enough that I was still quite young and that I had the time and ability to go in and study another degree. And so I went in and I enrolled in a Chinese language degree and studied that for 2 years, and which included 3 years, which included 1 year in China studying abroad as well.
Right. Okay. And how's your Chinese?
I don't speak very well, but I read every day.
Okay, right.
Yeah, I was not very good at the speaking and the listening aspect. Yeah. But for the reading and writing, it was just a matter of memorizing characters, and that seemed a lot easier to me. I seemed to be able to function a little bit better when things are visually for me. So when I read, it's just kind of, you're just reading pictures and stories. Yeah, and you just have to memorize a new character when you come across it. But when, at least when I was in China, Chinese people, you say hello, and then they fire back in their native speed, and you have almost no chance of comprehending what they've said. And so I thought that was very difficult.
Yeah. And for people that don't realise, like, Chinese is one of the only languages, or maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, if it's the only language that you can be fluent in one way of conversation with it. Like, you could be fluent in reading it but not understand the spoken aspect of it, and vice versa, right?
Well, from what I know as well, is that the written language is kind of like a little part of what united China is, because you had all these other dialects and things like that, but they all shared a written language.
Yep.
So, that's why you kind of have like, Cantonese, which is from Guangdong, and Hong Kong, they all speak Cantonese, but they all use the same written language as well. Yeah. But then when you go through China, they'll speak, like often I think Chinese people growing up, if they're not kind of in Beijing or somewhere where Mandarin is the main dialect, they'll have a regional dialect, they'll learn Mandarin at school, and probably English as well. So they kind of learn 3 languages, and sometimes their dialect might not be that different from Mandarin, but other times it might be quite different as well.
Yeah. I found that when I was in China, lots of people find that they learnt Chinese in a certain dialect, then they go to a province, they're like, I can't understand anything here. Well, it's so different, the accent's so different.
Especially what I found is, and I think it's similar in Australia, where the elderly have a lot tougher time understanding us, but kind of the new generation, they're probably used to people making some mistakes and things like that. You know, they give you a little bit more leeway when you were talking among your friends. But if you're kind of going out amongst older people, they, you know, if you kind of mispronounce something, they find it difficult as well. And I think that's kind of a bit common in Australia as well, where if there's been more elderly people who haven't been maybe exposed to new people learning English, they have a tougher time kind of dealing with accents or something like that. You know.
Okay. Awesome. All right, so let's talk about your passions in Chinese medicine before we get into the meat of your book. So you've got some thoughts about the study of Chinese medicine, right, and the directions in which it's sort of going. And lots of people watching this channel, probably from the UK, the US, Australia. It's a very similar way of teaching all throughout those places, right? It's all taught similarly, like a bachelor degree in either acupuncture or herbs or both. Yeah, I mean, and also I forgot to mention that you've also then gone and done a master's degree in Chinese herbal medicine as well, right, at RMIT. So what can you tell us about through your experience of fairly recently being a student, having that disillusionment in a way of like, well, how do I know what's the truth, or how do I know? You know, you're searching for that truth. What are your thoughts and your ideas that you've sort of come up with from that?
I think that the thing that we miss the most in the West when it comes to Chinese medicine is context.
Okay.
You know, why is this thing the thing that we do at this time? You know, and we often just get told, well, if you're seeing this, then you do this. And
as in what, like for people that aren't familiar with that, like seeing a symptom, you do this.
Yeah. You know, so maybe I'm trying to think of a good example. It's a little bit tough when you get put on the spot.
That's all right.
But maybe like you see blood deficiency, so maybe you just tonify blood. But is that all you do? Or if you see qi deficiency, you just tonify qi.
Yeah.
Is that all you do? You know, and it's kind of like, well, you know, then what are the kind of the underlying ideas behind here? You know, why is this patient qi deficient, and what does that mean? How did we come to diagnose those patients as qi deficiency or the blood deficiency? You know, what was the context of how those diagnoses kind of evolved? Because they weren't always called those things as well. They kind of generally evolved from what you would call like formula patterns or something like that, where you would have a formula that would treat a certain array of symptoms, and then, you know, by kind of reverse engineering that formula or what it does, you kind of come up with, well, this is the pattern that this is as well. But then it's kind of like, okay, there's that, but then, you know, you want to break it down further. And what I've noticed when I've read Chinese books is that they often always kind of like tie it back to kind of classical physiology from the Neijing, which is the Yellow Emperor's in a classic or something like that. However, there's multiple ways to translate it, but it's the oldest kind of fundamental Chinese text as well. And so when you're looking at these kind of diseases, it's not just this disease in isolation, but you're looking at it in the context of the physiology of the person, and you're bringing it back to kind of like your classics of the book. So you're developing a bit of a web of knowledge in your mind as well, where when you're treating the patient, it's no longer I just think they're qi deficient, but you think about it, okay, they're qi deficient, I'll think about this formula from this book, and then from this, maybe from this line of the Su Wen or something like that, or which is the Questions on the Plane, the book of the Neijing, about the physiology of it as well. So then you're kind of tying a lot of these webs of knowledge into how you practice and how you treat. And from what I read, that's kind of how the Lao Zhongyi or the old Chinese doctors would practice. They would think about these things, whether they're, you know, if you're kind of from like the Jingfeng or the classical formula school, their kind of way that they operate is they'll think, okay, you know, I see this patient and I think of this line from Discussions of Cold Damage, the Shanghai Lun, or from the Jingui. You know, they think, I see this, I'm seeing these kinds of symptoms, you know, 1, 2, 3, maybe not all of them, and then I'm going to, you know, prescribe this formula because it has quite a good chance of working because this is what I'm seeing. But the key there is that you're tying your practice to a source. And that to me is how I think you become...
Not just a source, but a very reputable source.
Agreed.
Right?
But I definitely agree with that. But I think then the problem is that most people don't tie it to any source, regardless. I mean, I think that Chinese sources are generally better than kind of Western. There are some good Western books, but I think that there's also a lot of bad Western books, and you've got to be able to differentiate the two as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the things for students in Chinese medicine, especially first year, like both Michael and I have been involved in teaching Chinese medicine over the years, and I'm sure you have this question as a teacher as well. And I have this question sort of a lot on the channel. So one is students, they're overwhelmed with all the knowledge of Chinese medicine. Like firstly coming into to TCM, like first year Chinese, they're like, wow, they're super excited about it. I remember being so excited about I want to learn everything. But at the same time I was like, fuck, I can't understand these books. It was so it's and then you just get you stop. I think because you don't know how to read an older text. You don't know how to read the Neijing or how to read Shanghai Lun or Jingui or something like that. And so then you rely on translated texts that are served up to you by the educational system, let's say, standard kind of textbooks. And not that there's anything wrong with those, but then they're quoting from classical sources, and that student thinks that is the classical source. They never go and actually look at the context of where did that classical source come from, what translation have they used, because it's in English, it's not in Chinese. They just want to pass their test or their exam, and they want to understand, they want to do better, but they're kind of in that conundrum of what advice could you give to students like that?
I think that when you're learning the foundations of the Chinese medicine, it's really important that you pay attention to where the quotes come from in determining the physiology of the body as well. So the heart governs the shen or governs the blood vessels, the liver governs the nails, the heart governs the face the liver governs the eyes, things like that, lung governs descending and dispersing. And you look at that function and you say, well, where did this idea in Chinese medicine come from? And so probably the best thing there is to find that quote that you read and then go back and read it in the context of the chapter of that book as well. And so you might not read all the chapters of the old books. You mean
the classical text?
Yeah, the classical text.
Let's say the text you're using is quoting from the Neijing.
Yep.
You want to go back and find
that quote in the Neijing and read it in the context of that chapter as well. Yeah. And then that way, just maybe ignore, I would recommend reading a guy called Paul Anschold's translations. Very, very good. He works with a big team. I think probably in my lifetime we won't see better translations of these works, maybe, but unlikely. And so you kind of ignore the commentaries that he writes below, but you read just that chapter. And so slowly you try and just, rather than kind of running up and diving off, podium or something like that, you kind of wade into the waters of the classics as well. So you kind of okay, I understand this quote now in the context of the chapter. And you just try and pick at it a little bit as well. You go back and maybe when the heart governs the shen, you read Su Wen chapter 8 of the Neijing as well. And then you find, that's where they say that the kind of the lung is the prime minister, the liver is the general, things like that. And you're oh yeah, I remember reading those things. Yeah. So sometimes when you go back and you read one aspect, all these kind of other aspects come as well, and so you say, well, why is heart fire? Why is heart, kind of the element of fire? Well, you might go and read Su Wen chapter 5, and you kind of reading it, and you say, oh, well, now they're talking about liver and wood, they're talking about spleen and earth, they're talking about all the 5 phases and the associations, and it's all there. It's in one nice little kind of bundle for you. But you need to go and look and try and find it as well. Yeah. And when you do that, you bring back the context of the medicine as well. And Paul Anschold's Su Wen is really good because he will write commentaries about those things, and that will help deepen your understanding. But first, a lot of my students will say, Michael, why does this do what it does, or something like that? But kind of the first step in Chinese medicine, and this is where I think sometimes Western education, not just Western education of Chinese medicine, has gone wrong, is sometimes you need to memorize before you can understand as well, right? And that's what Chinese had very much focused on. Even not out of medicine, even with their kind of like what they would call, I think they're like administration test or something. There's a proper word for it, like where you would become like a politician in China. Like you had to study and memorize, you know, your 4 classics, which were often like your Confucius, your Mencius, and I think maybe your Da Shui, which is the Great Learning, and Zhong Yong, which is your Great Mean as well. And probably the commentaries associated with that was a famous scholar called Zhu Xi, and he wasn't a physician or anything like that, but he was a very famous commentator of these texts as well. And so you had to memorize those. And kind of the saying was, well, like, if you don't pass that, at least you can become a doctor. So in China, the people who wrote the books were very, very smart people, because they might not have quite passed that. I think it was called the Imperial Civil Exam, something like that. Then they would still become doctors as well. And so these were still very highly intelligent people who were writing works in China. And generally the ones that survived are kind of probably the best that we have, right?
Yep.
So
those doctors had already memorized like a ton of like they were very knowledgeable in just being able to recall things like that, right? And I find students like that, I don't know whether it's just because we're a Google society now and we just have everything at our fingertips and we don't have to memorize it a lot. Students, especially younger students, find it hard. They do find it hard because they're just not used to having to do that. And so it's a new skill to train your brain how to do. And I think it's a good skill. I think it teaches you another skill that you haven't used before, because your brain has the ability, right, to do that. Yeah, you have to.
And when you're in clinic, you know, you've got to be thinking, oh, when I see this patient, they're kind of like, oh, you know, they might be, you know, I'll just do a simple one, you know, like sweating, kind of floating, moderate pulse, you know, maybe a little bit of cough, something like that, maybe slightly headache, not too many body aches or something like that. It's like, well, you know, any kind of like, you know, good Chinese physician will be able to come up with a pretty quick diagnosis, or you'd be within the realm of it if you knew your Shanghai Lun. And just by seeing someone, it's like, okay, bam, I now know how I'll be able to treat this patient and get probably a relatively good result if I'm reading everything correctly. You know, if you have to go back and then look in your book or something like that, then, you know, have you asked all the symptoms correctly if you haven't got them memorized in your head? Is there something that you've missed? Or do you think I go back and I ask this and they say no, then do I have to you know, change it? When I'm kind of treating patients, I kind of ask, you know, well, what's your main complaint? And then I kind of will ask questions, and as they're going, I kind of see myself walking down a path of saying kind of like, or if they say, yes, I've got to this, if they say something like, yes, maybe I have uncomfortable rib sides, then it's like, okay, now I'm starting to look at this from maybe a slightly different angle. I'm going to ask questions, you know, maybe relating to like the liver or Shaoyang, kind of gallbladder sort of things as well, and just try and see what kind of pattern they might be having there. So maybe, you know, about sleep or palpitations or, you know, kind of any like focal distension, glomus, things like that. But you need to, you know, you need to have these questions in your head so you can ascertain the correct diagnosis. What I see from a lot of my students is they'll come in and they'll sit down in the presentation room and they'll say, well, I'm not sure what I've got. Well, you need to kind of be working, you know, questioning to form your diagnosis while you're in there. If you're just asking questions without forming a diagnosis, then you haven't done the correct aspect of diagnosing there. Or and either that's maybe, you know, sometimes you get very, very difficult patients, but I think the majority you should still be able to kind of like come in.
At least 50%. At a third or fourth year level student, you'd expect like at least half of the patients you see, you should come out of that diagnosis room before you see your because most I would say most students clinics operate this way. You go in, you see the patient, you come out, you talk to your supervisor, and I've had that situation more times than I'd like to mention, where the students are perplexed, but also I don't know if you find this, but they just ask every question known to man because they don't know why they're asking it, and they're scared when they come out when they see the supervisor. Oh no, what if you're going to ask about urination? I better ask it. It might have nothing to do. But also maybe you can comment on this with your study in your translation in classics and thinking about how Chinese medicine used to be practiced versus how it's practiced now. Where do you think this idea came from to collect like all this information and these styles of Chinese medicine where, like, because in TCM most students are taught the 10 SMART questions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I teach. I'm sure you teach that too. Like, you taught that. We're taught to teach that, and it's a guide. Like, I see it as a guidance thing where you don't have to ask every single question. But a lot of students have it in their minds from somewhere, and sometimes it's other supervisors and other teachers that have told them this too. And they're not doing that wrong. They're just doing it because that's the system they've been taught. Do you think it is because of that lack of memorisation?
I think partly. I think one of the things with the 10 questions as well, I can't remember it now, but I had another kind of, it's kind of like, it's almost like questions on the 10 subjects. It shouldn't just be called the 10 questions, because I think this almost kind of gives this false idea.
They aren't 10 exact questions.
No, but the questions on the 10 subjects or 10 areas, right? Okay. So there are actually multiple questions within those 10 that you might need to kind of like talk about. There are sweating or hot and cold, chills and fevers, the head, the chest, things like that. So it's kind of like, and the thing is as well, I think it's kind of like, I think sometimes colleges want to have a little bit of due diligence where it's like, okay, you got to check this, you got to check that. And it's just like, well, did you ask about urination? Well, no, I don't think that urination is that important. Well, how do you know? Well, and I mean, I think sometimes the old doctors, they would just say, well, what's your problem? They might ask a few questions and then I say, well, okay, this is what I think is going on as well. But there's also, then if they don't ask about digestion or kind of, their stools, then you also might be missing something. It can be sometimes a two-edged sword where, but you might just say, look, is there a problem with the digestion? No. You go once a day? No. It's like, okay, bam. Then when I come in and present the case, there's nothing with digestion is fine. That's all you need to mention. You don't need to then say, no, they pass the stool once a day. They eat this, they eat that. You don't need to go. It's just like digestion is okay. The urine is fine. What I'm focusing on is they've got this maybe like back pain that is exacerbated in cold weather or damp weather or something like that. There's a little bit of swelling. When it's really bad weather, they get like heavy head, something like that as well. And so, and then then you just talk a little bit about the pulse and those sort of things. And I think it's just like that to me would show, well, this person has kind of really good confidence in what they're doing, and let's just try and see how that goes as well. Because I think, even maybe if you're not 100% correct with your diagnosis, and I even think that even diagnosis can be a fluid thing as well, a moving target, if you will, right? When someone comes in, after the week, sometimes the target might have slightly shifted. Not always. You definitely can kind of work with someone. But to me, it's like, well, even if the target hasn't shifted, you're hoping that they're feeling a little bit better or something like that as well. Or something might have developed. But you want to be a little bit fluid in that as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's good advice. And I think, so, I mean, we're not trying to say don't do what you... Like, if you're a student watching this, you should do what your teacher's telling you.
I agree as well.
You need to follow what they're doing, and they're doing it in... because they're the one guiding you, and don't go and say, oh, I watched Marie's YouTube channel and she said...
I think the thing to take out from what we're discussing here is that when you question, you're questioning with a purpose. Or you're diagnosing with a purpose of trying to say, right now you're walking down that path and you've got a diagnosis in your head and when you walk down, you think, I asked this question, is this giving me information to say, yes, this is my diagnosis? Or no, there's something else going on as well. And I think one of the problems, though, is that people think, well, no, this question might actually make my diagnosis incorrect, but there actually can be concurrent patterns happening at the same time. So maybe your diagnosis is actually correct. There's actually just a concurrent pattern going on. And maybe you need to figure out what's going on between. And this is why I think, unfortunately, 5 phases aren't taught a lot. But it's then, you might just say, okay, look, I've got this kind of lung heat, but there's also stomach heat, So is this a problem of, the parent and the child within the 5 phases as well? Oh, actually, but then, they're getting really frustrated as well. So is this then now, liver wood invading spleen earth as well? So those diagnoses aren't incorrect. They're very, very valid. Yeah. And I think that's probably one fault of this kind of emphasis of Zung Fu diagnosis is that it can only be this kind of one pattern. Or you want to come up with this one pattern when I think quite often people are multiple patterns or concurrent patterns. And that's why the 5 phases was so prominent in China as well, is that you see these, it allows for a person's dynamic as well, because I think very rarely does someone come in and it's just spleen, it's just lung, it's just kidney. No, you know, you might have like a lung metal failing to generate kidney water, and then bam, you know, with this one diagnosis you've included your two zung as well. You know, or you have, you know, excess of kidney water overcooling heart fire as well, and it's just like, well, that makes sense. So, you know, is this stomach heat actually heart fire coming into the, you know, stomach and spleen earth region, you know? So then you're actually expanding your ability to diagnose, and in my opinion, you know, making it more correct than maybe just looking at it from that one aspect, depending on, you know, what the people come in with.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and I think, so on one hand, like as a student, they might not know, they might not be great at memorizing, so they try to collect all this information. And like I always tell my students, similar to what you said, like you should just, if you're going to ask a question, you should know what the answer to that means. Like you should roughly have an idea, what does that mean? And and if you do, I find that then you don't ask questions that are just random, or like maybe just filling up the time, because I see some students like, well, this patient's booked in for an hour, I better fill up this half an hour with other questions, and then sometimes or repeating the same question and not really getting the information. Yeah, okay, good. So that's good. So I can say we both got the same.
I think on this, a really good diagnosis book is, I can't remember, but it's something like, it's by a guy called Deng, D-E-N-G, Tietao, Deng Tietao.
Yeah.
And that's a translation from a book in Chinese. And Deng Tietao was a very famous physician. I'm not sure if he's still alive, but I think if he might have only recently passed. But he was in kind of like 19th century, 20th century, sorry. And he was a very, very famous kind of modern doctor as well. And he wrote a lot of books of Chinese medicine as well. And it's quite a good book where it goes through quite a lot of questions and symptoms as well, and talks about them as well. So that would be a really good use for students trying to understand when I'm asking this question, what can it mean as well? It doesn't have a lot of references to the classics, but that's okay. I mean, they're not there, but they'll still help you understand Chinese medicine and what you're doing. I just can't remember the name, but it's Deng Tietao.
We'll find it out and we'll put it in the link.
We'll put it in the link, yeah.
Below,
it's got quite like I think a pink or purple colour with yellow circles on it. Something, practical diagnosis, something like that. But that would be a good place for you guys. And then the other one is the blue cover book by, I think something Yi Chiao and Al Stone as well.
Oh yeah,
and that can be quite a good book as well.
Yeah,
and it's kind of like, I like it because it's got some questions at the back of each section as well. And once again, that doesn't have like a lot of classical references, but it's still a really good thing to go in and remember to try and help you with your diagnosing if you're having problems. I mean,
I think that's a set text for the college I teach at. That's a set text, and they have a lot of charts in that book, that comparative chart. If you're sort of tossing up between, like, patient comes in with one thing and you're like, oh, do they have dry eyes or watery eyes? Like, it'll have that in the chart with the eyes and stuff. It's really useful as a reference tool.
I agree, but the key thing there is it's just like, you don't want to be looking at that when you're in clinic. You need to know that information. And so what's really important for students, I think, is you need to figure out, well, how do I learn? Do I learn by flowcharts? Do I learn by concept maps? Do I learn by rote learning? I think it's, you know, worthwhile even just, you know, writing down key features. You know, if you put, like, one thing that I would do when I was a student is I would just write down key headings, and then I would try and think about, if I see this, what do I know about that? What do I know about this topic? When I go back and I've still got the notes when I was a student of like the functions of the organs. So, you know, like I look at, you know, like the heart is governor, controls vessels, so forth, and like lung, you know, is the prime minister, governs descending in, for you know, is the meeting of the 100 vessels, governs the skin and stuff like that. So I put those in list forms, and then you try and talk about them and things like that. And so it's like, okay, when I'm diagnosing, you know, what are the patterns that I have to know? You know, like heart qi deficiency, heart blood deficiency, heart yin deficiency, things like that. And then try and think about the symptoms and all those sorts of things. But the key thing is that you need to know them. You need to memorize them. So when you're coming to clinic, you know what you're doing. You know what you're asking as well. If you don't memorize them, then it's kind of you're like a blind person walking without a light. Well, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. That's the thing, and I tell students in that first year often, like, you need to memorize like patterns of disharmony is the big one, right? Like, you just if you can't remember anything else, just try to memorize those patterns. Because I've seen students in fourth year still not be able to tell they come in, they go, oh, I think this patient's kidney deficient. You're like, where's the kidney deficiency? Like, or they give you and there's like, they say, oh, I think they have cheese stagnation, but there's no symptoms of cheese. They can't even remember. I'll say, well, what are the 4 main symptoms of cheese stagnation? They don't know.
I mean, I find it interesting because I see people say, oh, they're chi deficient, but they might be working 5 days a week. They play sport and things like that, and they're tired. And it's like, well, that's because they're doing that much stuff. They're not actually chi deficient.
Yeah.
That would tire someone out, you know. And you look at them, and they're maybe well built and things like that. They're not. Not that you have to be necessarily really skinny or frail, but you might be. But they don't actually look tired. But they'll say, well, they're doing all this and this, and it's like, well, that's still not really chi deficiency. These are real people who actually have, like, they have tired limbs. They wouldn't be able to exercise. I think if you really had true chi deficiency, it's kind of like, back then you might even be looking at kind of like things almost like how people present with chronic fatigue or something like that. That might be more kind of true chi deficiency. Pale face, but even then, probably nowadays, like if chronic fatigue is brought on by a virus or something like that, you kind of almost have like a little bit. They tend to have like more kind of like red face and kind of like almost like inflammation flare-ups as well. So that even then, you got to be careful about calling them chi deficiency or kidney deficiency as well, especially if there's some sort of kind of virus. From a Western point of view, the
Xiaoyang problem.
Yeah, definitely, and you see it flare it up as well. So I agree with that as well. So then you need to be careful about treating someone who appears to be deficient if they're not deficient as well. Because if you kind of give them, tonify them when they're not true deficiency, when you maybe, you need to clear heat, you need to harmonize or something like that, then there's this idea that you're kind of, you could be feeding whatever pathogen is with you as well. And
the patient just gets super uncomfortable, especially with herbs. I mean, I always tell acupuncture students you're kind of lucky in a way, because patients generally don't get worse from acupuncture. They just don't get better, but they don't get worse.
I mean, I somewhat agree, but I've seen some people do, like, I've seen people do like bad treatments where people won't come back as well. They might not get worse, but like if you're sitting there, you're needling your patient, right, and sometimes, like, they'll be sitting there, I'm like, the patient looks uncomfortable. You're looking at your patient. No, I'm looking down here. Look at your patient. They're uncomfortable.
Yeah, because they haven't memorized, so they're looking on an app to look where the points are. We should probably read.
Sometimes they're very focused on the needling as well, right? But it's kind of like, if you're chopping your vegetables and you've got something on the stove, you can't be just sitting there, chopping your vegetables and burn your food on the stove. Otherwise, you've got now cold vegetables and no food on the stove. When you're needling, you're kind of needling, and you're looking at your patient, you're doing that. You've got to be doing these things at the same time. You've got to be getting feedback from your patient. And even if you're not looking, you might just say, how does that feel? Does that feel okay? Are you feeling anything? Is it sharp? Is it heavy? Is it dull? So, and then you're also developing some rapport with your patient as well. And so then, even if you don't ask that question every time, they might say, oh, no, that feels sharp then. You've given them the opportunity to speak up if they need to as well. So I think that's very important as well.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I do like all freehand needling. It's and like sometimes it's sharp, but I just try and get people, hey, tell me if it's sharp. That's not the feeling that I'm going for. I like to get strong chi sensation as well. But I always tell people, if it's uncomfortable or anything like that, you want that feedback with your patient. Probably one thing that I would go back and if I can talk a little bit about is. When they're first year students and people are trying to decide what to read and what's a good textbook, I really think that you need to go back and you need to look at the reference list of books. And why would you do that? Why would I look at the reference books first? I mean, for me, the reason why I do that is because I want to know where this person is getting their information from. I want to know, have they got it from Chinese sources? Can they read Chinese as well is always a big one for me, because then if they haven't got it from Chinese sources, well, where are they getting their information from? How did this person write this book that if they don't speak Chinese, is this from their own teachings? I mean, okay, that might be fine, but then where did they get their own teachings from? Are these parts that they've been writing actually what I would call Chinese medicine? Because I think Chinese medicine has been weakened because we bring a lot of things into Chinese medicine that isn't Chinese medicine. And I think Chinese medicine is a very strong medicine when Chinese medicine does what it does best.
Yeah, okay. That's a really great point, And I think what's interesting, and I find this from talking to my students, is there's a real people really want to go back to that classical source. They are really interested in that. They're not just happy to be served up the good old books that are that they're told to read, and that's it, and just leave it at that. They want to know more. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm starting this series for students, to kind of talk about these things and help you. And have a broader conversation, I guess. And one of the things that I think is great, like now, is that when I studied, and I'm not sure about, I don't want to say when you, I don't know, I can't remember when you studied. I think the internet was around when you studied, right?
Oh yeah.
So when I studied, the internet was there, but you just had to go home to the old dial-up and kick your brothers off the computer.
I hope there was a GeoCities page on Chinese medicine.
Yeah, exactly. And you were like trying to log on, and like the YouTube was like you couldn't watch any videos. Anyway, what I'm getting at is technology is great because you can access people from all over the world. So you're not just stuck with, okay, I'm in my college, in my small town, or my place where I am, and that's all the access I have. And and the books that are there. But now you can easily get books. You can get ebooks from everywhere, but within that myriad of all that access to information and all these people, sometimes people are getting lost in there's so much stuff, and they're following all these different people and all these different ideas. And exactly what you said, some people are adding, and they're not doing the research on like, who is that? Is that person worth following? Is that person worth listening to? Am I going to listen to that? Don't just listen to every man and his dog what they've got to say, because they're not necessarily. That's what you're saying about the books, right? As well, like who's writing those books.
Yeah. I think you got to be careful. I mean, one of my favorite kind of Lao Tzu or from the Tao Te Ching quotes is something like, beautiful words are not truthful, and kind of ugly words are, sincere, or something like that. So, sometimes people will like, pretty something up so much, and you're thinking like, wow, this is the best thing that I've ever heard. It's amazing as well. But you still need to kind of cut through and just think, well, what are they saying? Is this clinically relevant, and how will I be able to utilize it as well? Don't sometimes get lost in the beauty of the message or the messenger, and really try and think about what they're talking about as well.
I mean, the thing with Chinese medicine that's never going to go away is that you have to be committed to study. Like, it's not something you can just do your 4 years or your 3 years, whatever you did, and then go out and practice and that's it. Like, it's a commitment to study. And like, I find this with the people I talk to, they're kind of like, they want to go to seminars. I'm talking about practitioners now, that they're like, oh, I want the 3-point wonder or the 5-point fix, or I just want to I want to do this weekend seminar.
I just want to do my 20 points
of my CPD.
And that's all I want to do. And but like if you do that, I think you'll have a very tough time elevating yourself above a mediocre level of physician. I really do, unless you're doing so much study at home. But even then, I think it's still quite difficult. To kind of elevate yourself above that level.
But you can't get these. I've talked to practitioners recently who are sort of like almost jealous that the practitioners are getting really good results and they're not seeing the same results those people are, and good on them for referring patients away that have needed that. But then they've been like, well, that practitioner got really good results for the patient I referred to them, and that practitioners would have spent probably a lot more. They just don't. They're not investing in their mind. They think, well, if I just went to this weekend seminar, maybe I could get that. And I was trying to tell this person, like, it's not a weekend seminar that's going to do it for you. You need to invest more time into doing it.
It is,
and part of it is just finding the right teacher to train you through that lifelong commitment as well.
I mean, I'm working on a book. My editor from my book, a guy called Alan Saw, is translating these first 3 chapters from a book called the Jingyue Chuanshu, or the complete compendium of Jingyue, which is a very famous physician from the Ming Dynasty. And he wrote 2 books. One's called the Classified Classic, which is a reorganization of the Neijing. And the other one is called the Jingyue Chuanshu, which is what Alan is working on. And in the start of it, there's a lot of essays. It's actually, he's the first person to develop the 10 questions, or questions on the 10 subjects. And he talks a lot about, he was also basically the first person to talk about the 8 principles as well. They're not exactly titled that in his work. He pretty much sets the motion for someone to later call them that. And he wrote his Classified Classic. He said something like he spent 30 years writing it and rewrote it 5 times.
Wow.
You know, and that's the level of dedication that these people had in our medicine prior to us. And I think it's kind of, you know, we need to be like, step back, be humble, and kind of think about, you know, we really need to realize we're standing on the shoulders of some very great physicians in Chinese medicine, and really try and elevate our medicine back up to the level that the physicians and the scholars had attained in the past as well.
Yeah. I think you're totally right. Yeah. And that people just need to put in the work.
I agree. You know, like I think we can complain about everyone else, but if you know, we've got to look at what we're doing first as well. How about, you know, I remember this quote from famous scholar Stephen Boyington, and I think it was by a famous author who I can't remember, Kurt Vonnegut or something like that. And he said, you know, be careful what you say you are, because that's what you'll be. Right. Or something like that. That's not a good paraphrase, but it's like, you know, when we call ourselves Chinese medicine practitioners, I think that we need to kind of be aware of what that means, not only now but in the past as well. And so, you know, to me, if you were to call yourself a Chinese medicine physician in the past, that means that, you know, you would have studied a good portion of the Neijing, so the Su Wen, the Ling Shu. You would have done your studies on the Shanghan Lun, the discussions of cold damage, the Jingui, you know, the Shennong, the Divine Farmers. But then probably also you would have read in English some of Zhu Danxi's work, some of the Li Dongyuan, so the school on the spleen and stomach as well. And in China, if you read in Chinese, you probably would have read like a guy called Lu Wansu, and Cheng Wuji. Lu Wansu was the first scholar who looked at these. It was really interesting because he's one of my favorite people to look at, because he basically almost sets the scene for Chinese scholarship of Chinese medicine for the next kind of 900 years, where he basically writes about the pathomechanisms of the Neijing, of the 19 lines from Su Wen chapter 74, and he quotes them, and then he extrapolates and talks about them as well. So it's very much like how one would write an essay now, but they were doing it 800 years or 900 years ago, and they were using it via the source of the Neijing as well. So they still had, you know, great reverence for this text, but they would reference what they were talking about. And so when I see people talk, I always try and say, hey, where are you getting that idea from? Where does that idea come from? How did you're at D now, how did you start from A, B, C, D to arrive at D? And if they can't answer me how they got to D, then I need to be a little bit skeptical of it as well, and question, is that part of Chinese medicine? Because from what I've seen and read in the past physicians, they always used very logical deduction, where they would say, okay, you know, I'm starting out with A, and then I'm going to talk about it as well. And maybe you disagree, but you can still see their logic on how they arrived at their conclusions as well. And I think because in the West, we've been somewhat removed from our classics and removed from this idea that we want to work with a source of our Chinese medicine. And what I call the source-based medicine is that people have a little bit more, how to say, kind of almost freedom or liberty to say what they want and not get questioned on how did they arrive there as well. And I think that's a little bit dangerous. We need to kind of be questioning these people, well, especially if they want to challenge older and ideas as well. It's like, well, how well do you know that old idea? And you know, you're proposing this new change. You know, why?
Yeah, so interesting. So there's some really good tips there for students that, you know, like if you're studying or you're thinking about studying Chinese medicine, or maybe you're even a practitioner and you're like thinking about, well, I want to do some more study, or I
should always want to be doing more study.
Yeah. But I mean, look, we're not judging people here. Like you can just get busy, and you can just get into that place where you're in a rut. And I've been like that in my practice from time to time. And you've just been like also not knowing. It's easy to continue on a path of study, I think, if you have a good teacher and you know, and you've got someone to follow, and you know that's all kind of, you know. But if you don't even know where to go, you're just in that place, and that can be a good place because it can lead you somewhere, versus being just ignorant and not even knowing that you should be in that place of looking. I agree. So look, it's been so great to have you talk about all this stuff, Michael.
Thank you.
And we're going to do another episode where Michael's going to talk about his book specifically. So you can click the next video to hear about that. But just thank you so much. Now, where do you practice in Queensland?
So I practice in Chermside, which is not far from here. We're in Aspley right now.
But you watching this might be somewhere else. It might not be in Chermside.
Yeah, so I practice at Chermside, and I still work there in my teacher's clinic as well.
Awesome.
And so, it's a nice little clinic as well, and it's really enjoyable.
Yeah, we're going to pop the link to Michael's clinic, so if you've got some questions about his practice, you'd like to see him in his practice, then you can click that link and you can find out more about his stuff. And also for his book, make sure you click on the next episode because we're going to talk specifically about his book. But if you just want to find out about his book, we'll put the link to that below as well.
I also have a little blog that for students as well that I try and I sometimes go in and out of blogging, and I try and blog a little translation of something, whether a formula or something like that, maybe once a week when I'm feeling like it as well.
Awesome.
So that just tries. I like to do that so people can kind of get an idea of how this is how they were talking as well. And even then, it's they might not understand. They might not. I won't ever translate the whole book or anything like that. But they think, okay, I see how he's talking or she is talking in this aspect. How can I extrapolate that and apply that to other ideas or other formulas or other points or herbs or something like that?
Yeah, great, awesome. So make sure you sign up to Michael's blog. So thank you so much for being here and
my pleasure.
giving up your time and teaching us about all these great aspects and giving these tips for students. I think that's really, really important. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening to the Chinese Medicine Podcast. Did you know we're also on TikTok? And you can find shorter videos on Facebook and Instagram that you might like to share with your friends and family. You can also find our podcast on Apple, Spotify and all places where you listen to audio podcasts. I look forward to seeing you again on the next video soon.